Reading should be like eating. If you taste a food, you're like, ugh, that's nasty. Well, maybe it gets better. Ugh, no, it's nasty. Same thing with a book. If you don't like the first chapter, you're probably not going to like the second chapter. Put it down. I don't know why people are taught to finish what they start. That's a stupid strategy. I mean, there was over 4 million books written in English last year alone. Some of them are pretty good. If you're not liking this one, put it down, get another one. Figure out what turns you on.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today we're joined by Danny Brassell. Danny, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian and Tanya, and I appreciate all that you do. Thanks for spreading joy in the world.
Thank you. We always like to start off every show by learning more about who we're speaking with, so we'll ask you the loaded question. Who is Danny Brassell?
Definitely a loaded question. Well, Brian, I'm considered America's leading reading ambassador, which is kind of ironic because I grew up hating reading. The only thing I used to read when I was a kid was the TV Guide. My father, ironically, was a public librarian, and I always hated the public library. It always smelled funny. The furniture was uncomfortable. There was an elderly woman always telling me to be quiet. And there's always some homeless guy who thinks he's a vampire hanging out at the public library. I always hated it. And it wasn't until I actually started teaching in the inner city many years later where I observed that most of my students didn't have the advantages I had growing up. I pointed the finger at myself. I said, shame on me. I mean, I grew up, I was very blessed. Both of my parents were in the home. We were lower middle class, but we always had food on the table. And our parents, they always read to us, in front of us, and we always had plenty of access to reading materials. And it really, it sobered me up. And I realized, there's a lot of kids that don't have those types of advantages. And so it really became my mission to spread a joy for reading in the world. And really, in the last 25 years in education, I kind of challenge teachers and parents where I find that schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching kids how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read a book. I want them to choose to do it on their own because they love it. And so that's what my passion is really spreading a joy of lifelong learning all around the world to kids and actually even adults that hated reading when they were growing up.
Which would be me.
Yeah. All right, you didn't have me as a teacher, Tanya. I'll get you to love reading by the end of the podcast.
And you know what? I was actually the same way. I hated reading myself when I was in school. I think actually the entire time that I was in school, there wasn't a book that I read in its entirety. When I had book reports, I would always pick a book that one of my friends was reading and just find out what happened from them and write my report based on that. It wasn't until I was an adult where I actually started to enjoy reading. So for you, what was kind of the transition that made you who you are today, a guy who really loves reading and loves sharing the joy of reading?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. I mean, I didn't like reading until it was interesting. My university required that we study abroad for a year. And so I was in Spain, and it was a great experience for me because for the first time in my life, I was actually discriminated against. Without realizing it, I was born with all sorts of advantages. I was born white, male, and American. And I always had like this free card that I didn't realize I had. And it wasn't until I lived in Spain and people treated me differently because I didn't speak Spanish. They thought I was stupid. And I'm not that stupid, but I didn't speak Spanish. And it was a really great experience for me because it put me in a different, other people's shoes. And it was odd. When you're in a country where people speak a different language and you're trying to learn the language, you have headaches, you have nightmares. And I started learning anything in English. And a girl, she handed me John Grisham's The Pelican Brief, and I read it in a day. And then I read A Time to Kill in a day. And then I remember going to a bookstore and buying a used, beat up paperback copy of John Grisham's The Firm for $30. And I read that. And after graduating from John Grisham, I advanced to Mary Higgins Clark, and Sidney Sheldon. And now I'll read anything and everything. And I love actually picking out books for kids. I think that's really one of the biggest mistakes that schools are making, is they require kids to read certain things. And I always point this out to people. Our research is really clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. You know, the little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to be a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. I mean, Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare. But first of all, we got to get people hooked on it. And so, and I know, you know, Brian and Tanya, you're both being very modest, because I see a ton of books behind you. And if I was there physically, I really love looking through people's books because I'm nosy. And it's interesting, you know, and that's really what learning should be, is I want kids learning long after they leave my classroom. I want them to have a zest and a joy for learning. And that, especially during the pandemic, you know, you can be stuck in Ontario, but if you have a library card, you have access. It's basically your passport to the world. You can travel the world without ever leaving your home.
Now, it's interesting you say that about the Captain Underpants, because I've heard, you know, kids say, oh, my teacher said I couldn't pick that up at the library, because obviously it's more that comic book type setup. But when you say that, hey, it's at least they're reading. It's something better than nothing. And it's true, right? It's, you get that practice. And, you know, if the kids want to fall asleep to the Dogman reading it, and they read it in like a day or two, and that ups their, you know, their esteem, like, oh my goodness, I got a book done, and, you know, 1 or 2 nights before bed, right? Hey, I'll take it, especially being somebody who's not that passionate about reading.
Yeah, and I point this out, Tanya, to people. I speak all around the world. I was speaking to a corporation just a couple of weeks ago, and I asked all the executives, these important people in their suits, I said, well, what was your favorite thing to read growing up? And at least 70% of the audience said Superman, Fantastic Four, Batman. I'm like, comic books count. You know, actually, comic books are written at a level that's about twice as difficult as the network TV news. There's all kinds of great vocabulary in comic books, and so comic books count. And again, this requirement drives me nuts. I was doing an interview last week on Nigerian television, and Nigeria was a British colony until the 1960s, before it got its independence, but it still basically uses a British schooling system. And so what they're doing is they're forcing the kids to read Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare. And there's nothing wrong with any of those authors, but I think that they'd have a lot more success at getting kids excited about reading if they introduce the students to Nigerian authors like Chinua Achebe. I mean, there's plenty of people, you know, and I'm not saying that you have to read about people like you, but I'm saying that's a great entry point to get you interested. I'll give you an example. When I was teaching 2nd grade, I've spent most of my career teaching in South Central Los Angeles, and I had a little boy, Kiara, and Kiara's 1st grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. Well, thank you for that. Well, Kiara, who don't know nothing, comes into my classroom one day. He's like, hey, Miss Brassell, you see Barkley last night? He had 18 points and 16 boards. I'm like, thank you, Kiara, because from that day forward, every afternoon after lunch, I'd sit Kiara on my lap and we'd read the LA Times sports page together. And would you know it, by the end of the year, Kiara was one of the best readers in the class. And all that kid ever read was sports, you know. And I mean, and frankly, there's great research on that. I mean, President Ford, I remember one of his famous quotes was when he was president of the United States, the first thing he read was the sports page. And journalists were freaking out. They're like, "You're the leader of the free world. How can you read the sports page before the front page?" And he said, "Well, the front page just lists all of man's failures. The sports page celebrates his achievements." And I thought, wow, that's a positive outlook on the world.
That's really interesting. It's funny too, because when I think, you know, as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to what I used to read. And largely when I was younger, it was comic books, because that's what I was interested in. You know, it started off with like, you know, the Superman, Spider-Man, the Marvel series. I read all of those. Going into, you know, once I hit 10, I started playing basketball, started playing sports. So I would read a lot of sports books. Michael Jordan's
Mhm.
autobiography, even though he was still actively playing at the time. So there wasn't a whole lot to that autobiography by any means. But again, those were the things that I was actually interested in. Those were the things that I would actually read. Yeah, I think it's Mark Twain who said the man who doesn't read has no advantage over the man who can't read. So in your opinion, why do you think it is that people don't read? And I know some of it's based on interest, but what are some of the other things you've seen?
Well, they could have a reading difficulty. And I always tell people that, all reading disabilities are curable. And by far the most undiagnosed reading disability is dyslexia. And people that feel self conscious about that, I'm like, well, just so you know, you're in good company. I mean, over half of the Fortune 500 CEOs are dyslexic. Famous people throughout history, from government people like George Washington was dyslexic, to entertainers like Whoopi Goldberg and Tom Cruise and Sylvester Stallone, to business tycoons like Sir Richard Branson. These are all dyslexics. And so I want to point out to people, you're in good company if you're dyslexic. There's other reading disabilities besides that. But I really think, Brian, interest is the big thing that I really wish we'd get away from this book requirement. I don't understand why literature. I mean, now that you're in the business world, Tanya, when was the last time you were in the office and somebody said, here's this novel, I need you to read it by tomorrow? Nobody ever says that.
No.
They didn't really prepare you for like technical reading. I was working with a fourth grader, and his teacher said he didn't like reading at all and he couldn't read very well. I'm like, I was with this kid for an hour, and in an hour, he must have texted 20 people. He sent several emails. He was surfing the web. I'm like, he's highly literate. You're using a definition from 75 years ago. I hear this all the time. They always say, oh, people don't read anymore. I'm like, that is such baloney. I mean, people are reading so much more now than they've ever read in their life. But reading isn't just confined to War and Peace by Dostoevsky. Reading is surfing the web. Reading is checking out all ads as you're driving on the road. Reading is a lot more than that. I mean, I remember, Brian, when I was in high school, my teacher made me read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, The Scarlet Letter is about this woman named Hester Prynne, and she commits adultery, and so she's forced to wear an A on her chest. And I asked my teacher if I could wear a B on my chest because I was so bored reading that book. I don't understand why we force, why is The Scarlet Letter any more important than reading a biography about Michael Jordan? I mean, at least when you read about Michael Jordan, I've read, Michael Jordan's one of my idols, and I've read so much. The David Halberstam book on Michael Jordan's phenomenal. And Jordan is like the great success story because he never gave up. Like yes, he's the greatest basketball player ever to live. Anybody wants to argue me? I mean, I like LeBron James too, but I mean, Michael Jordan, I tell people, they had during the pandemic, I would have died if the ESPN hadn't had The Last Dance about the Chicago Bulls. I was like waiting for it every week. And it was great watching it because I forgot how much I loved Jordan. I remember every game he did something where my jaw dropped, and it wasn't like dunks. I forgot how his layups, the guy's in the air for like 7 seconds. I'm like, how does he do that? Or how does he track a player where the player usually scores 40 points and Jordan holds him to 6 points? And he was just amazing. A fierce competitor. He was never afraid to take the last shot. He was never afraid to fail. I just loved him. And so that reading about him was great. I mean, I've read every sports book out there. I love sports books. And I don't know. You got me on a tangent, Brian, because now I'm going through memory lane, and it just irritates me hearing that like you who actually had a passion, a teacher didn't identify that passion and develop a curriculum around your passion. That, to me, anybody can teach. It takes a lot of hard work to be a good teacher. And if you have 33 students, most likely all 33 of them have different interests and different motivations. And it's your job as their teacher, as their coach, to figure out exactly what it is that stimulates their curiosity so that they'll do it without you telling them to do it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the biggest one, right? Like, we can say to the kids, pick up a book and read. I can say to myself, you got to read more, right? But I guess the question is, how do we get people to read more?
Yeah, so Tanya, I mean, I should put you on the payroll. It's basically my program. There's my program's different than every other program out there because every other program out on the market teaches kids how to read, and I think those are important. And I by all means, I tell people you should get your kids out there doing programs like that. My program's different in that I get kids excited about reading. And so basically my program works, it's designed for parents and teachers where every day for 67 consecutive days, I give about a 5 to 7 minute video giving ideas to parents and teachers about ways to get their kids excited about reading at home. The two numbers I always emphasize to people are 67 and 20. So the number 67, a lot of people you'll hear say it takes 21 days to change a habit. To those people, I say, show me the research on that. It doesn't exist. I actually know exactly where the number comes from. It's from a wonderful book written in 1960 called Psycho-Cybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. And in the preface of that book, Dr. Maltz was a plastic surgeon, and he says that he noticed that it took most of his patients about 21 days to get used to their new face. Well, a lot of self-help gurus, a lot of people that I respect, by the way, they took that number and started telling people it takes 21 days to change a habit. And it's totally false. Well, researchers at the University of London in 2009 decided to do a habit formation study, and they determined they found that it took anywhere from 18 to 254 days to change a habit, and the average was 66 days. I don't like the number 66, so I threw in a bonus day, 67. And it actually depends on the habit you're trying to change. So if you want to drink a glass of water before you eat breakfast, that might take 18 days to develop that habit. But if you want to quit smoking, that's going to take 254 days to change that habit. And here is why this is important to me, Tanya and Brian. Let's say you are on a diet and you follow it religiously for 21 days, but on day 22, you fall off the wagon. Well, you blame yourself, which is completely wrong because research shows it takes at least 3 times on average to develop that habit. The other number I always emphasize to parents is 20. So researchers were looking at habits around the world of successful students. They wanted to see if there was any common characteristic. They discovered one which blew them away. And it was the number of minutes spent reading outside of school. They looked at the low students, the average students, and the high students. They determined that students testing in the 20th percentile at the bottom of their class, the F students, they averaged less than a minute a day of reading outside of school. That didn't surprise anybody. That's probably why they're at the bottom of the class. But this did startle the researchers. The kids in the middle of the class, the 70th percentile, the C students, the average students, how much time did they spend reading outside of school? The average was 9.6 minutes a day. And so when I'm doing a live training with parents, this is usually when the audience gets really quiet and the first hand raises and a parent asks me, wait a sec, are you saying if I can get my kid to read for 10 minutes outside of school every single day, I can take him from an F to a C? That's exactly what I'm saying. There's a lot of research on this, but this is really what shocked researchers. The kids near the very top of the class in the 90th percentile, did they spend 3 hours a day reading outside of school? No. Do they spend 1 hour a day reading outside of school? No. The average was just over 20 minutes a day. So 20 minutes a day. The entire focus of my program is finding those 20 minutes a day. And here's 2 things that are great. First of all, being read aloud to is just as good as reading on your own. So if parents, if you have to drive your kids to school 10 minutes each way every day, I always say, well, put in an audio book, and on the way to and from school, you just covered your 20 minutes there. And then the other thing that's important is those minutes don't have to be consecutive. So it can be 2 minutes here, a minute here, 5 minutes there. What we're trying to do is to develop habits. This is kind of my passion, is habit formation. And what I find is the easiest way to develop a new habit is a concept known as habit stacking. So you take a habit that you already have and you try and place the new habit with that. So for example, if you're trying to read, make it so that you listen to an audio book every morning when you're brushing your teeth and every evening when you're brushing your teeth. Not only will you become a better reader, but you'll have better dental hygiene, things like that. I'm sorry, I'm going on. I realize I have long answers to your short questions, but I get excited about this stuff.
No, that's really good. And you actually really unpacked a lot in that, answering that question. Like, I always think too, even for myself, right? Okay, when am I going to give myself that amount of time to get into a book. So when you explain it that, it doesn't have to be all at once, you can be reading a few minutes here and a few minutes there. I think that sort of relieves a little bit of that stress of, oh, how am I going to keep this up every day? It's the same with, I guess you could say, working out and all that kind of stuff, right? Like if you set the bar too high, are we going to really be able to accomplish it every day? But when you set the bar, to where it's, okay, kids, you know what? You don't have to spend an hour reading after school. I get you want to play outside or do this. But hey, if you could spend a few minutes reading or listening, I think, again, for kids, that's something that's doable.
Yeah, that's a perfect comparison, Tanya. I always tell people resolutions fail, routines work.
Mm-hmm.
You don't lose the weight by running 2 hours all of a sudden. You lose the weight by making it a 15-minute jog every single day and making it into a routine. When I taught middle school, I was the only teacher in the history of my school to not have a single tardy student. And the reason was because I always started class with a Paul Harvey story. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Paul Harvey, but I listened to Paul Harvey on the radio growing up. He passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 325 years old. But every day at 12:15, he'd come on and say, "I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story." And he'd tell you this story, and it was about a 5-minute read aloud. And the whole time you're trying to figure out, well, who's he talking about or what company he's talking about? And I loved it. And then actually the last book that I wrote, Leadership Begins with Motivation, it's like it's kind of an homage to Paul Harvey. I realized the Paul Harvey stories, a lot of them were about things that kids weren't familiar with, like Sears and Roebuck. Well, that's an old company. So I had to develop an updated version. And if you'll let me, I'm just going to read a quick little, this is the kind of way I get kids reading. So here's a quick little story. On the morning of January 17th, 1977, Gary Gilmore, in a plain t-shirt, strapped into a chair with a bag over his head, awaited a firing squad of 5 law enforcement officers to execute him at the state prison in Draper, Utah. Convicted of murdering a gas station employee and motel manager in Utah the year before, Gilmore would be the first person in the United States to be executed in nearly a decade. Shortly before his execution, prison officials asked Gilmore if he had any last words. Neither he nor anyone else that day would know the impact of those words. Over 10 years later, in 1988, Dan Whedon, an advertising executive who co-founded the Whedon and Kennedy Agency in Portland, Oregon, made something of a morbid pitch to a struggling fashion company. He recalled the inmate's final words and used a slight variation for his pitch, and seemingly everyone hated his idea for the company's new slogan, "Just trust me on this one," Whedon implored the company's co-founder. And the co-founder, his company, and the public have not looked back since. The co-founder's name was Phil Knight. The struggling brand he co-founded was a shoe company called Nike. And advertising executive Dan Whedon slightly altered death row inmate Gary Gilmore's final words into the phrase, "Just do it." The phrase has become Nike's signature slogan, helping to turn a niche brand into a global multi-billion-dollar giant and etching the phrase indelibly into consumers' minds around the globe. So that's how I get kids excited about reading. And it was actually kind of interesting. After I wrote this book, I was reading it, and completely unintentionally, this is fascinating. Almost all of the examples in this book are of white male Americans. I'm like, wow, that's weird. I had no idea that was it. And so the book that I'm writing right now is almost entirely female, minorities, and international examples, because I think kids need to be exposed to lots of different. When I was teaching, I had a parent, she eloquently said it to me. She's like, "I don't need you to teach my kid how to be Black." And I actually agreed with her. I'm like, oh, she's making a good point, because I had predominantly African-American Latino students. And so I read a lot of books written by African-Americans, Latinos. And I realized, oh, well, that's part of my job. The other part of my job is to expose kids to cultures that they might not be familiar with. And so I think those are the types of things a really good teacher should make you curious about, where you're just sitting there, if I had Brian when he was one of my students, I would find that passion for basketball, but then I would start figuring out, okay, now that I got him hooked on basketball and interesting people, I'm going to find stories like, here's a story about China, get him interested in China or something like that. Because it's really one of the most powerful things I do, is when somebody significant in your life gives you something to read, you're going to read it. Whether it's a buddy or a pastor or a teacher or a coach, it's nothing more powerful. I mean, I do this all the time with kids where, the first 4 times I do it, they might not read it. By the fourth time, they are reading that book, because there's nothing more significant than somebody that is important in your life telling you, I was thinking of you when I was reading this, or hey, Tanya, man, did you read this article? There's this great article in the magazine. You should check this out. Well, you're going to check it out because somebody was thinking of you when they talked to you about it.
Mm-hmm. So going to, I guess, the teenagers and that age, and, just dealing with all the electronics and games and everything that's out there, how do you encourage parents or teach parents to get them even motivated to put down the other stuff and pick up the books?
Yeah, I think you're facing an uphill challenge trying to resist it. I use kind of a Taekwondo philosophy. I embrace the technology and figure out how I can use it to my advantage. And so probably one of the best I recommend to parents, I'm like, well, I have a feeling that television is here to stay. So a simple trick I tell parents is turn on the closed captioning on the television set. And a lot of people say, well, wait a sec, if the show's in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? I'm like, well, that's a fair point, but let me make a point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles? That's very difficult to do. Yep. Your brain is directed towards that text, and there's actually research to support this. If you look at reading scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every single country in the world except for one. The country that watches the most TV in the world has the highest reading scores in the world. It's Finland. People always ask, well, how can that be? I'm like, well, because Finland makes really bad TV shows. And what they have to do is they import all these old American sitcoms like Welcome Back, Kotter and the Brady Bunch. And then they have to subtitle everything in Finnish. The kids are reading constantly. So there's a quick trick for every parent out there. There's some captioning. It's easy to do it. And again, I don't fear technology, Tanya. I mean, a lot of these video games, I mean, if I was just working with a kid the other day, and that's all his mom's like, all he wants to do is play his video games. I'm like, that's fine, because I have a book here on how to get to the next level in that video game. I'm like, would you be interested in reading this? And all of a sudden, her son's like, how do I get to the next level? I'm like, this kid that won't read anything read that chapter in 10 minutes because he was interested in it. It's amazing how when you're interested, I mean, the happiest day of my life, besides my wedding day, was when I got my PhD. My wife asked, why are you so excited? I'm like, from now on, I get to pick the books. And to me, that's what it should be. I mean, again, you two hated reading growing up, but again, I'm going to give you a hard time because you have a huge bookcase behind you right now. Obviously, there's something that you're interested in, and it's interested in you enough that you've invested time and money in developing a library. And now that you're parents of 4, it's even more important to demonstrate to kids. I mean, I've taught parents that don't even know how to read, how to get their kids excited about reading. And it's kind of interesting when the kids finally figure out that their parents actually don't know how to read. But it doesn't matter if the kids see you reading. I mean, I used to run a nonprofit called Real Dads Read, and I used to challenge dads. I'm like, hey, Dad, you want to know why your kids like football so much? It's because that's the only time you spend with them. If you spent your time reading with them, they would be readers, because every kid wants to be their parents, whether you like it or not. Every parent is a role model for their kids. And, I get really excited showing parents the power that they have that they don't realize that they have. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Tanya. But again, teenagers don't frighten me at all. I embrace that technology. I mean, in the amount of texting being done and stuff. I'll give you an example. I volunteer at a juvenile detention facility. And one of the ways I get the kids excited about reading is we've replaced book reports with this concept called 6-word stories. And so their book report can only be 6 words or less. And so the kids are always writing these 6-word stories, and kids that never used to write, it goes to your point you were talking about with fitness. Now they're writing 200 to 300 6-word stories a week. Well, you got them excited about it. So now you can ask them to do something a little bit more significant. I was with these girls. I mean, they're kind of a rough bunch, and the counselor was telling me, oh, you're not going to be able to get them reading anything. Oh, I got them reading within a week. I gave them a copy of Us magazine, and in the back of Us magazine is this area called Fashion Police, where they have all these comedians that diss on celebrity outfits. And these girls can't get enough of it. They're like, oh, do you see what she said? And they have a great time. You see, again, what are we doing? I got to figure out. And I mean, I love the challenge, you know, and good parents, good teachers were constantly eavesdropping. I mean, if you hear your kids talking about NASCAR, get something about NASCAR for them to read. If they're talking about J-Lo, get a Jennifer Lopez biography. I'm always trying to figure out, well, what are kids' interest? What's their attention span? I've heard this phrase, so, I've never liked to read. I'm like, I'll get you reading. I'll get you reading. I'll get you passionate about it. And even if you won't read it on your own, I can read it to you, and that's just as good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. Well, even just throughout this whole conversation. Now, the one thing that I think of is I learned probably a lot more once I finished school just by reading on my own, again, because I was reading what I was interested in. And, you know, again, a lot of that I've applied to my career, and it's really helped me get to where I am today. And I think it was Albert Einstein. Yeah, it was Albert Einstein. Hopefully I remember the quote, but he basically said, don't let your education get in the way of your learning. Or it may have been schooling. Don't let your schooling get in the way of your learning, or the way of your in the way of your education. But yeah, it kind of speaks to that point. And just thinking in terms of that, I'm just curious to get your opinion. I have my own thoughts on this, but I want, since we have the expert on, I want to hear from you. What, I guess, the correlation between reading and success, or just, reading in our overall intelligence?
That's great. Well, I'm going to answer that question. And the question I have for you, Brian, is I want to find out what you're interested in reading now. So in my studies of successful people, whether they're in business or in government or in entertainment or athletics, there's plenty of readers that don't become successful leaders, but I've never read about a successful, effective leader that's not an avid reader. I mean, whether it's Elon Musk or Pitbull, all of them are reading all the time. I could have kissed LeBron James before the NBA Finals when he was playing for the Miami Heat. They went into the Heat locker room and they showed LeBron James reading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. And I could have kissed him, because I'm like, you just did more for reading with that picture than I can do in a million years. I mean, people that are successful are constantly reading to give themselves an edge. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest men in the world, that's all he does every single day. Now, he's not reading novels, obviously. He's reading things that'll help him acquire businesses, but he's reading. Elon Musk, he was bullied as a kid, and he spent all this time in the library. He actually read every book at his local library and started ordering books. And even to this day, they say he reads at least a book a day, usually multiple copies. I read the biography on him by Ashley Vance, was absolutely fascinating. There's an anecdote in there where he's at SpaceX and he would always ask the engineers questions, and it started annoying some of the engineers because they're like, I'm already hired, I know what I'm doing. And then they realized, wait a sec, the questions were getting more and more sophisticated, and what they realized was he's asking the questions to learn from us, and he's learning it, and he's learned more than us. That's fascinating to me. I'm interested, Brian, and also with you, Tanya. Now, what are the types of books that you're interested in reading? What caught your reading bug?
For me, it was a lot of books on communication, leadership. Like I like to call it my John Maxwell shelf back there.
I love Maxwell too. I love him.
So, a lot of John Maxwell stuff, and then a lot of it's just things that I'm trying to learn right now, or things that I'm trying to improve at for my, either my career. So the first book I read this year, because I'm just trying to do a book a week and focus on a book a week. Any other reading I do on top of that is, just things that I'm interested in or a bonus. But I read a book on doing product demos, because that's a large part of my job. Right now, believe it or not, I'm reading a book about doing RFPs, requests for proposals, for anybody who doesn't know what that is. But, again, that's another kind of important component of my job. So I'm just trying to get better at that. And then I have a lot of printed materials here for upcoming meetings. So just to prepare for those. So one of the things that we've just recently done is the Clifton Strength Finder. So I've, I did, the last one I did was 8 years ago, and some of my top 5 have changed. So again, just doing some reading up on the things that are new for me. So those are kind of things that I'm interested in right now.
Yeah. And these are Brian's books. They're not mine. So I'm still not the biggest reader.
Well, what are you interested in, Tanya? What can we get you reading?
I was sitting here thinking, and I'm like, you know what? I technically do read. Do I pick up books? No, I'm more into I was thinking, I'm like, for the moms, I mean, for anybody really individually, but the busy moms and stuff like that, for me, it's easier for me to pick up and read a blog article. And obviously, parenting usually is the biggest one that I'm reading on and learning from. But to me, I guess I rather the quick read, 5-10 minutes, grab something from it and keep going. But I keep saying, because there's been a few interviews, it's actually really funny. It's like the common theme, reading. So not that I made it a goal or anything, but maybe I should change it up to actually start like physically sitting down and reading books, especially after you're mentioning it's not all about the time, it's more about or the consecutive time, right? Because I'm like, really, at the end of the day, by the time you spend your time doing stuff on social media or other things like that, you definitely can fill it with reading up and doing something like that.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned too was audiobooks. So we use Audible. I know Tanya
Yeah,
was listening to the Michelle Obama book on there. When we were driving, I listened to a lot of Brian Tracy because he has some really good content, and it keeps everybody quiet because usually the tone that he speaks at puts everyone to sleep. so I listen to a lot of him as well.
Well, Tanya, what you should do, if I may, is I would, invest in some cordless headphones, and you don't have to do even Audible. I mean, most public libraries, there's apps now where you can check out Audible books for free, and those count. I mean, so like if you're making dinner or doing chores or taking a walk with your girlfriends or whatever, just put it in and make the goal of 10 minutes a day. Just start with 10 minutes a day. Yeah. You'll be amazed how many books you get through that way. I mean, because the Michelle Obama is great. The Audible book I'm listening to right now is Will Smith's biography by Mark Manson, and Will Smith narrates it. And it's fantastic. I absolutely, it's like 16 hours. I'm all excited because I have to drive to Minnesota on Sunday. So I'm like, I'll finish that book with no problem. I'm actually kind of worried because I'm trying to figure out another Audible book for the drive back. But that's what I would do. And John Maxwell, you can't get better than John Maxwell. He's exactly what I love. I love stories. I'm like, you got to give me anecdotes. I wrote actually, and I wanted to give that to your audience. If your audience goes to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, and you can put it in the show notes. I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. It's a book that I wrote for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. And so every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation that demonstrates the same concept. You can read that in 5 minutes. You'll like it, Brian. I have a story in there about when Michael Jordan was going to retire the first time. Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner of the Chicago Bulls, told Phil Jackson, you got to talk him out of it. Well, Phil goes to Michael and he said, well, I'm supposed to talk you out of retirement. I can't talk you out of retirement, Michael. I know that. But just know this, Michael, that you play basketball the way Picasso painted, the way Beethoven wrote symphonies. And if you retire, you're going to deny millions of people the pleasure of watching you play basketball. Well, Jordan still retired, but those words hung in his head. And one of the reasons he came back was he never forgot what Phil had said. See, I love little stories like that. Mm-hmm. What was it that got them doing that? So those are the type. And then also when you get a free gift from Danny.com, I'm also giving everybody access to like an appetizer. It shows you it's one of the 5-day challenges I did with parents, giving them all kinds of tips on how to get their kids excited about reading. Because I always tell people, the more excited you get people to read, the more likely they are to read. And the more you read, the better you get. And we're all much better as a society if we're all an informed a society of critical thinkers. I had begun my career as a high school history teacher. And the first thing I always pointed out to my students, I'm like, history books are usually written by the winners. Every event in history has multiple points of view. And in this class, we're going to consider different points of view. You don't have to agree with the point of view, but we're going to learn how to respectfully listen to one another. I'm here to teach you how to think, not what to think. You need to use that thing between your ears. And I tell this to people nowadays, there's no such thing as fake news. There's people that depend on one news source. Like, you have a brain, you should be reading, you should be finding out the answers on your own, not just because one commentator told you it was a good idea. I mean, I just always, I was a journalist before I was a teacher, and you're never allowed to just go with one source. Let's hear multiple sources and figure out, is this the actual story? I mean, I can tell from your banner behind you, Brian, you're a Toronto Raptors fan. I mean, Kawhi Leonard, people say he's difficult. I'm like, well, is he difficult? I mean, everywhere he plays, he's a champion. I mean, he takes teams, what he did with Toronto is unbelievable. So I don't know if I believe that. I don't see how you can be that difficult and be that effective of a leader on the floor. So and that would interest me. I want to read more about him, So again, the long answer, short question, Tanya, start listening to Audible books, and you can get them for free at the library. And you can do those short, like if you want something short, any of those Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul books are fantastic, because those are quick little stories. Brian, I'll tell you a story about Brian Tracy. When I wrote my Read, Lead, and Succeed book, I sent it to him and asked him if he would give me a testimonial, an endorsement. I've never met Brian Tracy. I had never met Brian Tracy in my life. Within 48 hours, he sent me a glowing testimonial.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I'm like, here's one of the most successful business authors on the planet, and he took the time to write me back. And what I love about that, Brian, is he taught me how to be with people. Is he took the time, and he doesn't know. I mean, I give another story where I'm a huge USC football fan, and I was at Heritage Hall, and I saw football coach Pete Carroll, and I said, "Hey, coach," and he totally blew me off. And that was one of the most important lessons of my life, because it taught me every encounter matters. That meant nothing to him. It meant the world to me. He didn't know that I'd become a public speaker and tell that story to over 100,000 people. And he could be Mother Teresa, but to me, he'll always be a jerk. And it was a very important lesson. And look at those two different people: the people that took the time, and the people that don't take the time. So I wanted to give that little endorsement to Brian Trey. And then years later, I actually paid to go to a conference just so I could meet him. And I told him the story, and he was just, we spent like 5 minutes talking. He was so nice. And it really taught me, this is how to be with people. And there's a reason he's as successful as he is, because he makes, I love to tell the story of Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny, was a contemporary of Queen Victoria, and she knew every famous person of the day. And a reporter once asked her about the difference between Prime Minister Gladstone and Prime Minister Disraeli, and her response was phenomenal. She said, well, whenever I left a meeting with Prime Minister Gladstone, I left feeling like, wow, he is the most interesting person I have ever met. But whenever I left a meeting with Prime Minister Disraeli, I left feeling like, wow, I am the most interesting person he has ever met. So what are we doing to make the people around us feel important every day?
Absolutely. Now, just based on everything that we discussed and, some of the preparation we did for today, you've had the opportunity to do a TED Talk, you've earned your PhD, you've written books. Is there any one thing that stands out to you as something that you're, an accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Oh, nobody's ever asked me that, Brian. That's a great question. The thing I'm the proudest of is I had created my own nonprofit that created school libraries. I taught in Compton, California, in South Central Los Angeles. And I used to physically create school and classroom libraries. And I almost felt like Sidney Poitier in the movie Lilies of the Field, where he builds the church for the nuns. It was just so much gratification seeing kids that had never had access to a really awesome library, just seeing them so excited, seeing all the teachers excited. And you just saw so much pride. And it's ironic that the boy that grew up hating libraries, now I look at communities and I'm like, but the library should be the focus of every community. This is where everything's happening. I mean, libraries, for better or worse, serve as daycare centers for a lot of parents. Libraries offer heat to the homeless. Libraries are places where people meet. You know, I absolutely love libraries. And now the way that they're designing libraries, you have like the coffee shops and the libraries and the little bookstores. Yeah, I think probably besides being married to a wonderful woman and having 3 wonderful kids, my proudest accomplishment was when I used to get to make libraries for kids. That was great.
That's awesome.
Thank you for that question. I love that question.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm sitting here, and as we wrap up, I'm going to throw it out there and say, by the time this airs, I will be getting into the habit of reading or listening to books at least 20 minutes a day. I'm putting it out there.
Well, you don't have to do 20 minutes. I don't want to overdo it for you, Tanya. I mean, 10 minutes is fine. We can gradually get you up there. But here's a trick. And I want everybody, for all those listeners who have that large 800-page book on your bedside table that you started 3 years ago, I absolve you of that book. Get another one. I mean, reading should be like eating. You know, if you taste a food, you're like, oh, that's nasty. Well, maybe it gets better. Ugh, no, it's nasty. Same thing with a book. If you don't like the first chapter, you're probably not going to like the second chapter. Put it down. I don't know why people are taught to finish what they start. That's a stupid strategy. I mean, there was over 4 million books written in English last year alone. Some of them are pretty good. If you're not liking this one, put it down, get another one. Figure out what turns you on.
Fair enough. So I was just going to say, Danny, where can we find you online? And if you have anything in the works for this year, anything you'd like to share with us, please do.
Yeah, again, if you get a free gift from Danny.com, that'll give you access to the book plus a training. It'll give you a nice little whet your appetite for the program. I've got the readinghabit.com is my reading program. Actually, what I'm really excited about now is I've teamed up with Diarmuid Hudner, who's this wonderful gentleman from Ireland, and he created a social media platform for kids ages 6 to 12, which only kids can go on. So they're approved by both the police department and by the school system. And Brian types a message to you, Tanya. It says, Tanya, I think you're ugly. Well, it won't send the message. It says, ugly's not a nice word. What's a better way of phrasing that? Wow. And basically, kids stop writing negative things to one another. And we find that in Ireland, and actually it's now in the Middle East, it's actually completely eliminated cyberbullying. Wow. And so he and I teamed up because both of us are into positive habit formation for kids. And so, my expertise is reading, and now we're developing socio-emotional learning strategies for kids, character building. And I'm really excited because he and I both have a passion. We're really interested in spreading this throughout Africa, the Middle East, India, and Pakistan, developing countries where we can actually have a huge impact on the next generation of kids. I'm always an optimist. Everybody's always doom and gloom. And I'm like, well, I think there's always nothing ever amazing has ever come out of a pessimist. Pessimism doesn't get you anything. I'm an optimist. And I think that I get excited about technology. I mean, I was just listening to some people griping about Zoom the other day. I'm like, well, Zoom just allowed the 3 of us to have this wonderful conversation. And you're in Canada. I'm in Colorado right now. I mean, I put it to the people this way. What if we had the pandemic and we didn't have Zoom? Oh, yeah. Can you imagine how tough that would have been for people? I mean, seriously, 10 years ago, we couldn't have done this. And so I'm excited. And I'm excited about technology in general, because right now there's some kid on a dirt floor somewhere, barefoot, probably didn't even eat breakfast. But if that kid has a laptop and an internet connection, that kid has the same access as the president of Google. The world just got a whole lot smaller. And I, for one, am very excited, because you don't have to be born in New York City anymore to change the entire course of society. I get very excited thinking about the positive possibilities. I think that answered your question, Tanya. I get off on my
well, that will be a whole nother podcast interview talking about that and the program that you're creating. That sounds amazing.
Now, one last question before we kind of wrap things up. And just for my curiosity, if you found out today you could only read kind of 3 books on loop for the rest of your life, what 3 books would they be?
Oh gosh, crazy, Brian. I hate things like this. Books that I have to read over and over again. Oh gosh, I don't like to give the standard answers because everybody's always going to say the Bible, that's a great book. It's inspirational. You can say the complete works of Shakespeare. I don't know, something. Well, I don't know if I can give you titles, but I'll give you this. I wrote a book once, and an editor told me, Danny, you're a really funny writer, but if you truly want to be a great writer, you got to make people laugh, you got to make people cry, and you got to make people think. And so if I had 3 books, I guess I'd find a book that made me laugh, a book that made me cry, and another book that made me think. So that's kind of a lame answer. I don't want to give specific titles. I can tell you this, I'm reading constantly. So like me personally right now, I share with you the audiobook I'm listening to is the Will Smith biography. The book I'm reading personally for my own benefit. I told you the book I'm writing is about women, minorities, and international examples. So I'm reading a biography on Golda Meir, who was the first female prime minister of Israel. My oldest daughter, we're reading, what's the series called? Shadows and Fire, I think. This series she's into. My son and I are reading The Killer Angels together, which is about the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a fantastic book. And then my youngest daughter and I were reading, she just wanted to read The Great Gatsby. I hate that book and she loves it. So I have to read The Great Gatsby with her. And then my wife, it's actually interesting. She introduced me to this series that I actually love called The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon by Beth Brower. And you might like these, Tanya. They're each about 150 pages. They're really short. And it's just about this British woman and all of her male suitors and in the 19th century. My wife's always into these. If we ever go to the movie theater and we see a poster and there's all these explosions, I'm like, oh, that's what I want to see. And then we see a poster and it's 2 elderly British women drinking tea. I'm like, oh no, that's the movie I want to see. That's what you want. My wife loves those like Jane Austen kind of things. But I'm actually getting a kick. This series is actually pretty good. So I'm always reading different things. And then I have another website people can actually check out. It's free for everybody, lazyreaders.com. If you subscribe, it's a free subscription once a month for the rest of your life. I update it with 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages. So you have something you can read when you're stuck in a boring meeting or whatever. So, oh man, that was a horrible answer, Brian. I'm trying to think of actual titles, but to read them over and over again. I will say Shakespeare though, because actually one of the things, this is a little trick I do on my phone. I have like little reminders. So I'm like trying to learn different scripture from the Bible. And so, like at 1:23 every day, I get an update to remind myself to go over James 1:21, 2 verses 2 and 3, which is consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Ooh, got it. There you go. So that's my 1:23 reminder. Every day at 9:11, I wanted to learn the litany against fear from the book Dune. So every day at 9:11, I get, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over and through me. And when it has passed, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. When the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. See, I'm learning it. I'm trying to learn the King Henry V, St. Crispin's Day speech. Which is very long. I won't bore you with that. But that's another way. That's another way to get yourself reading is when you're trying to learn. If you want to memorize certain things and make it into a game, I do it every day.
Oh, awesome, Danny. Appreciate the time. Thank you for sharing all of that with us today. And I hope you have a great day.
Thanks for all that you do, Brian and Tanya. Be safe and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.
Thank you.